Today we're jumping straight into a source you've brought us. It's a classic, really, looking into the moral heart of Japan, especially through its most, well, iconic figures, the samurai.
That's right. Yeah, our source for this deep dive is Inazo Nitobe's Bushido, The Soul of Japan. And it's a really fascinating book written around the turn of the 20th century.
Okay.
Nitobe was a Japanese scholar, and his main goal really was to explain these ethical principles, especially of the warrior class, to a Western audience, people who maybe didn't get it at all.
Right, who might have found it totally foreign.
Yeah.
And so our mission today is to unpack Nitobe's core arguments like what he thought Bushido actually was, where he believed it came from, and how he saw its influence, using
Right.
only the info from the source material you've shared.
Exactly.
Think of this as your essential guide, to getting this unwritten code through Nitobe's eyes without having to, wade through the whole book yourself.
And Nitobe was actually pretty clear about what made him write it. He mentions being quite stunned by a question. It came from a European jurist.
Oh, the question about moral education. No religion. How do you teach morals? That one.
That's the one. Yeah, clearly, stuck with him.
Mhm.
And that, plus his wife apparently asking him all the time about Japanese customs and ideas, he realized the answer, the missing piece, was this unwritten code, Bushido.
Oh.
Precisely. He felt it was this really deep set of principles, almost instinctive. He calls it a law written on the fleshly tablets of the heart.
Right.
He really believed that if you didn't grasp Bushido, you just couldn't understand the moral foundations of modern Japan. It would just be opaque.
Okay, so let's start right there then. What is Bushido in Nitobe's view? How does he define it?
Well, the literal meaning is military knightways.
Ah.
So it was the code of conduct, basically. The principles the fighting nobles, the samurai, were expected to follow.
In daily life and, their job as warriors.
Yeah, both. It was their version of the precepts of knighthood, their noblesse oblige.
And you mentioned it wasn't like a formal written law. Why was that important to him?
Because it wasn't some doctrine handed down by one person or written down in, a legal book. It was something that just sort of grew over time, organically, among the samurai.
Okay.
It was sanctioned by what they did, by their customs, by deed, not doctrine. And this developed among this privileged warrior class who, well, they needed some common standard of behavior, especially given they were often on a belligerent footing and you had all these different clans.
So less like a rule book and more like a cultural standard, something that just emerged from their situation.
Exactly. And Nitobe uses this really powerful image. He says it's a flower no less indigenous to the soil of Japan than its emblem, the cherry blossom.
The cherry blossom.
Yeah, and he felt really strongly that even after feudalism, the system that birthed it, was gone, Bushido was still alive, still influential.
That cherry blossom image is pretty striking. It's beautiful, native, but also hints at that readiness to fall, doesn't it?
Yeah,
That's a certain tone.
it really does.
Speaking of roots, though, Nitobe traces Bushido back to several different sources.
Yeah.
How did these, seemingly different traditions kind of blend together to make this unique code?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. He shows how Bushido isn't just one thing, it's a mix, a synthesis.
Mhm.
So from Buddhism, for instance, he saw things like calm trust in fate,
Okay.
quiet submission to the inevitable, that sort of stoic composure when facing danger, even a kind of disdain for life, or maybe a friendliness with death, as he puts it.
Right, like the story in the source about the swordsmanship teacher, the one who was just calmly getting ready for his end, not bothered by everyday stuff.
Exactly that kind of detachment. Then you've got Shintoism.
Okay, so what did Shinto bring?
Well, if Buddhism gave that inner calm, Shintoism brought intense loyalty to the sovereign, reverence for ancestors, filial piety. He felt it instilled a certain, maybe passivity isn't quite the right word, but a deep reverence in the samurai character.
That reverence for the emperor, seeing him as this divine figure representing the nation's unity, that connects patriotism and loyalty right into a spiritual feeling.
It really does. But Nitobe says, for the actual ethical doctrines, the main source was Confucianism.
Ah, yeah, the foundation of social order stuff. The 5 moral relations. Master and servant, father and son.
Husband and wife, older and younger brother, friend and friend.
Exactly. These ideas, with their kind of aristocratic, conservative focus, they were just perfectly suited for the samurai as a ruling class trying to keep social harmony.
Makes sense.
And alongside Confucius, Mencius was also hugely important. He held immense authority.
Mencius, weren't his ideas sometimes seen as a bit more democratic? Maybe even a bit risky for the time? Yeah, they were sometimes seen that way, but they still found a place in the samurai heart. Nitobe points out how Mencius linked rectitude or righteousness to following your proper path, and benevolence to having the right state of mind.
And he lamented people losing their true mind, right? Like
Mhm.
losing a pet and not looking for it.
Exactly. He saw that as this powerful metaphor for moral neglect, how people could lose their moral compass and not even try to find it again.
So it wasn't just about knowing the classics intellectually.
No, not at all. Knowledge was important, sure, but it was secondary to ethical feeling, to wisdom you could actually apply in life. It wasn't learning just for learning's sake. It was about living right.
Okay.
And that connects to another influence he mentions, this Chinese philosopher, Wan Yangming.
Oh, yeah. The one who stressed that knowing and acting are basically the same thing. To know and to act are one.
That's him. A big influence on some samurai figures. He talked about conscience being like a spiritual light from heaven, guiding you spontaneously towards right and wrong. Nitobe does note, though, that this idea of conscience being infallible was sometimes taken to an extreme idealism, almost like pure spiritual intuition.
So Nitobe paints this picture of Bushido as this really complex blend. You've got spiritual resilience from Buddhism, loyalty and reverence from Shintoism, practical social ethics from Confucianism, individual righteousness from Mencius, and this link between inner truth and outer action from Wan Yangming.
That's exactly it. He's showing how all these different threads got woven together into this unwritten code. It's this mix of spiritual, social, and personal ethics that gives it its unique shape.
Okay, let's unpack some of those key threads, then the core virtues.
Yeah.
What did Nitobe see in the absolute key principles a samurai lived by?
Well, he puts rectitude or justice right at the top, calls it the most cogent precept. A samurai, he says, absolutely hated anything sneaky, any underhand dealings. He defines rectitude as the power to decide what to do based purely on reason without hesitating. Even, the power to choose death if that's the right course.
The source uses that really strong image, calling rectitude the bone that gives firmness and stature. Like without that underlying structure, talent or learning don't make you a samurai.
Right, it's the essential framework. But then he brings up this other concept, giri, which is complex.
How so?
Initially, jiri apparently meant duty based on right reason, so very close to rectitude. But Nitobe argues that over time, it kind of degenerated, became more about external social obligation, or sometimes just fear of what others would think, fear of censure.
Ah, so this jiri could lead to actions that seem, well, pretty strange or even harsh from our perspective, contrary to justice.
Absolutely. The source gives some really stark examples, like a mother sacrificing her other kids for the firstborn son, or a daughter selling her chastity to pay off her father's debts.
Wow.
Nitobe sees this distorted version of jiri as often involving twisted logic, what he calls casuistry, sometimes just a cowardly fear of what people might say. He draws a sharp line between that and real duty, which comes from love, versus duty forced by external pressure.
That difference between genuine internal duty and that external, maybe fear-driven obligation, that seems like a really key insight Nitobe is making.
It really is. And right alongside rectitude, he places valor or courage.
It's twin brother, he calls it.
Exactly. And he points to Mencius again, who defined courage not just as physical bravery, Mencius said. Seeing what's right and not doing it shows you lack courage.
Ah, so it's moral courage.
Right. True courage, as Nitobe links to Plato's definition too, isn't just rushing into danger blindly. It's knowing what you should fear and what you shouldn't.
So he distinguishes between great valor, that moral courage, and just physical toughness, the valor of a villain.
Precisely. And this kind of courage, this fortitude, was actively trained from a really young age.
Yet the source mentions mothers scolding crying boys, asking, what will you do when your arm is cut off? Or when you have to perform harakiri? And that story of the young prince of Sendai who was starving but thought it was a disgrace to feel hunger. Intense stuff.
Incredibly intense. They had the system of drilling the nerves, he calls it. Exposure to cold, hunger, deprivation. Even sending boys to, execution grounds or spooky places at night, or having them mark decapitated heads.
It sounds unbelievably harsh.
It does. But the goal, the ideal, was to cultivate complete self-control, total composure, even when facing death or extreme danger. The aim was for a samurai to stay calm, maybe even compose a poem or hum a song.
The anecdotes really bring that to life.
No.
Oda Doken finishing his poem after being fatally speared.
Or Sadato and Yoshi having that rhetorical contest right in the middle of a battle.
And that amazing story about Kenshin. weeping for his rival Shingen, calling him the best of enemies, and then sending him salt during a blockade because, as he said, I do not fight with salt, but with a sword.
Those stories are fantastic, aren't they? They show that mix of fighting skill, but also intellectual grace, and sometimes this surprising chivalry, even towards an enemy.
Definitely. Okay, moving on from those more martial virtues, what about benevolence or mercy?
This was seen as incredibly important. Confucius and Mencius often called it the highest requirement for a ruler. And Bushido's version of Mercy Bushi no Nasake, the tenderness of a warrior, wasn't just some soft, fuzzy feeling.
No.
No, it was a mercy that understood justice and, crucially, came from a position of power to actually do something, to act. It was effectual mercy.
Mencius talked about love having the power to overcome obstacles like water putting out fire, and about sympathy, that feeling of distress for others being the root of benevolence.
Yes, emphasizing that true compassion is active, it's powerful, and the source includes that incredibly moving story of Kumagaye.
The warrior who hesitated to kill the young prince Atsumori in battle because he saw his own son in him.
That's the one. He ultimately did kill the prince, but only to spare him a worse death at other hands. And then he was so affected, he gave up being a warrior completely and became a priest.
And that saying, it becometh not the fowler to slay the bird which takes refuge in his bosom, it reflects that same idea, right? That tenderness was valued even in that warrior culture.
Absolutely. And Nitobe also points out that the arts, music, poetry were seen as ways to cultivate these gentler feelings.
Oh, right. He mentioned Polybius on how the Arcadians used music to soften their character.
Yeah, and that story about the rough country samurai whose fiery spirit was eventually calmed and he learned to appreciate a warbler's song. It shows how art was thought to refine even the fiercest people.
Okay, next up is politeness. Nitobe sees this as way more than just good manners, doesn't he?
Much more. He sees it as like the outward sign of inner benevolence and modesty. He knew Westerners sometimes found the elaborate Japanese etiquette a bit much, maybe even inefficient, but he defends it. He argues, kind of like Herbert Spencer talking about grace, that politeness is actually the best way to do things, the most economical, efficient, and graceful way.
He uses the tea ceremony as an example, right? Something that looks really tedious from the outside.
Exactly. But Nitobe says, if you look closely, it reveals these deep principles. Economy of time and effort, spiritual discipline, everything about it, the intense cleanliness, the bare, simple room, the focus on design over flashy colors, getting rid of all display. It's all presented as a kind of modus operandi of soul discipline.
Wow.
A way to refine your taste and show spirit mastering flesh through this really meticulous practice. Bienséance, he calls it.
And flowing naturally from that outward grace has to be inner truthfulness, sincerity.
Absolutely critical. Without sincerity, Nitobe says, all that politeness is just an act, a farce, lying, being deceitful. That was seen as deeply cowardly.
The samurai's word, bushi no ichigan, was enough.
It was considered sufficient guarantee. Written contracts were actually seen as beneath their dignity. If you were found to have a double tongue, nigh gone, the only way to fix it was through death.
The source also points out their aversion to casual swearing, contrasting it with Christians who often swore despite commandments against it.
Yeah, a sharp observation there. And Niobe uses this point to contrast the samurai code with the merchant class.
The merchants, who were ranked lowest socially, below knights, farmers, artisans.
That's right. He argues that putting the stigma on trade, combined with the samurai's general ignorance about and disdain for money, filthy lucre, actually contributed to lower standards of business morality overall. Thrift was okay, but for self-control, for abstinence, not for getting rich. And later, when samurai had to go into business, they often really struggled, just a sheer lack of shrewdness, he says.
But their word, their integrity, was still seen as the guarantee, which led to those amazing phrases and promissory notes like, I shall say nothing against being ridiculed, or you may call me a fool if they couldn't pay. Just trusting their honor.
Which Nitobe finds quite different from the maybe more pragmatic Anglo-Saxon idea of honesty is the best policy. For the samurai, he suggests, honesty was its own reward, fundamentally, not just a tool for business success.
And that leads us right into the concept of honor itself.
Yeah, absolutely central. It was this really vivid sense of personal dignity and worth, something the samurai cultivated intensely, and it's tied directly to the idea of shame.
Mencius called shame the soil of all virtue, right?
Exactly. The fear of disgrace, of losing face, was incredibly powerful, sometimes maybe even morbidly so.
The source mentions that possibility of it going too far. Like that story, which he admits might be exaggerated about the guy killed just for mentioning a flea on someone.
Yeah, Nitobe is careful there. He warns against judging the whole code based on extreme or abnormal cases. Like, you wouldn't judge all of Christianity by the Spanish Inquisition, right?
Good point.
He sees that extreme sensitivity as maybe a distorted expression of a real virtue, but yeah, definitely prone to going overboard.
And he says it was supposed to be balanced by things like magnanimity and patience, with sayings like, to bear what you think you cannot bear is really to bear.
Precisely. Ieyasu's famous maxims fit right in. Haste not, reproach none, forbearance is the basis of length of days. That idea of patiently waiting for the nightingale to sing instead of forcing it.
Mencius also talked about patience, but combined with righteous anger when needed.
Yes. And the sayings Nitobe quotes from figures like Ogawa, Kumazawa, and Saigo about not returning evil for evil, reflecting on your own faults, loving others as yourself, they show these really striking similarities to Christian teachings. It suggests, for Nitobe, that natural religion can arrive at similar truths.
Although Mencius taught that real honor comes from within, not from what others think. But Nitobe observed that, in practice, honor often became just about reputation, vainglory.
Yeah, seeking worldly approval. He notes that for many young samurai, fame was the main goal more than wealth, even more than knowledge sometimes.
And in chasing that fame and honor, life itself could be seen as, well, cheap. Which brings us to another huge virtue, loyalty. Nitobe calls it the keystone of the whole system.
He really does. He sees it as maybe the most distinctive part of this code, taken to an extreme perhaps not seen elsewhere, sometimes even overriding loyalty to parents, which was so central in China.
The source tells that really intense story about Mishizani's retainer, the one who sacrificed his own son.
Yeah, substituting his own young son to save the life of his lord's heir. It's presented as this profound act of vicarious death.
Chilling. The source compares it to Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac as this ultimate act of obedience to a higher calling.
It shows that absolute commitment to duty. Family was sacred, yes, but in Bushido, the interests of the lord or the clan, representing the state, could demand everything. The state came first, before the individual.
It reminds me a bit of Socrates arguing with Crito. The idea that the city nurtured you, so you owe it everything, even your life.
A similar kind of thinking, yeah, though in Bushido it was often focused on loyalty to a specific person, a lord representing the state. But, and this is crucial, Nitobe stresses that Bushido did not demand blind obedience.
Oh.
No. The source notes that a samurai who just blindly followed a bad or capricious lord, sacrificing his conscience, he was despised, called a nason, a cringeling.
So, you could disagree with your master, but it clearly took immense moral courage and wisdom to know when and how.
Exactly. It wasn't simple obedience.
Okay. Speaking of extreme actions and choices, Bushido was often associated with practices that seem, well, really perplexing or severe to outsiders.
The most famous one, of course, is suicide, or seppuku, also known as harakiri, self-killing by cutting open the abdomen.
Yeah. The source kind of anticipates people thinking how absurd, and tries to head that off by mentioning Western parallels, like suicides in Shakespeare or Addison's play Cato.
Right, suggesting the idea of noble suicide isn't totally alien to Western culture or art. And he explains the focus on the abdomen based on that old anatomical idea that it was the seat of the soul and emotions.
He mentions biblical phrases and the French use of ventre or entrailles for deep feelings. Even hints at some modern neurology supporting the gut-brain connection.
Yeah, trying to rationalize the physical act. But the really key point for Nitobe is that it wasn't just random self-destruction, it was an institution. Legal, ceremonial, highly formalized.
Invented in the Middle Ages, right, and used for specific reasons.
Exactly. To pay for crimes, apologize for mistakes, escape disgrace, redeem friends, or prove your sincerity. And it demanded absolute calm and composure during the act. It was a performance, in a way.
The source includes that really detailed, maybe even graphic, eyewitness account from Mitford's Tales of Old Japan.
Yes. The description of the temple setting, the witnesses, the formal announcement by Taki Zenzaburo, the ritual itself with the short sword, the wakizashi, and the role of the kaishaku II, usually a friend or relative who delivered the final blow to hasten death.
It's incredibly vivid. It really emphasizes how structured and, well, ritualized it was.
Yeah.
And that other story about the brothers Sakan and Naiki helping their younger brother Hachimaru perform it correctly.
It shows just how deeply ingrained and accepted this was within the samurai class, even for children, guided by their elders. It's quite shocking to us, but it was part of their world.
Though Nitobe does admit there was a darker side, he notes that many people rushed into seppuku for questionable reasons, reflecting that view of life being cheap compared to honor, and that honor itself was often mixed with baser metals, as he puts it.
He does acknowledge that. He calls that impurity of motive a saddest feature. But, and this is important, he offers a counterpoint.
Which,
Bushido also taught that rushing into death, or courting it when you didn't need to, was actually cowardly, unless the cause was truly just. Real valor, he suggests, quoting Sir Thomas Browne, could sometimes be found in daring to live when life is more terrible than death.
Mencius also taught that enduring suffering could build character. So the ideal wasn't just dying, but bearing hardship with patience and a pure conscience.
Exactly. So it's not just about embracing death. The other institution he talks about is redress, or katakiuchi, vengeance.
Specifically for wrongs done to your parents or your master, right?
Yes. It was seen as a kind of informal justice system, an ethical court of equity, he calls it, for cases where the official law didn't provide a remedy that satisfied this deep sense of justice for certain kinds of insults or injuries.
The famous story of the 47 Ronins fits here, doesn't it? Their revenge for their master was illegal by the letter of the law, but everyone celebrated it anyway.
Precisely, a classic example. Their actions were condemned officially, but popular feeling was entirely with them because they fulfilled that duty. However, Nitobe points out there were limits. Revenge was only considered justified for superiors, parents, masters, benefactors, wrongs done to yourself or even to your wife or children. Those were supposed to be borne with forgiveness.
Interesting distinction. And like seppuku, he notes that both these practices, ritual suicide and vengeance, largely lost their reason for being once Japan established a modern, comprehensive criminal justice system.
Right. The state basically took over the job of dispensing justice and punishment, though seppuku did still happen occasionally, apparently.
Okay. Beyond these major institutions, Nitobe also looks at the symbols and supports that kind of embodied Bushido's spirit, and the big one has to be the sword.
Oh, absolutely. The soul of the samurai, he calls it. The ultimate symbol of their power, their skill, their status. Its importance started really young, with that ceremony around age 5 where a boy received his first swords.
And they carried two, right? The dado and shodo, or katana and wakizashi.
Constantly. Constantly. And these weren't just tools. They were revered. Almost worshipped sometimes, kept in a place of honor. Insulting someone's sword was like insulting them directly.
The swordsmith wasn't just a craftsman either, was he? More like an artist.
An inspired artist, yes. The forge was treated like a sanctuary. The whole process of making the sword was seen as a deeply spiritual, almost religious act. The smith was believed to put his soul and spirit into the blade.
And the blade itself, he describes it almost poetically. Collecting vapors, its perfect texture, the sharpness, combining grace and strength.
It's clear there was deep aesthetic appreciation alongside the practical function. But again, Nitobe balances this. He makes sure to point out that actually using the sword could, and ideally should, be avoided.
Right, like that story of Count Katsu.
Yeah.
The guy who lived through really turbulent times, but apparently never drew his sword in anger, kept it tied shut.
Exactly. Katsu is quoted saying he had a great dislike for killing people. He even said, "I will not cut, even if someone cut him first." It shows that despite the sword's symbolic power, there were popular sayings like, "To be beaten is to conquer," or "The best victory is won without bloodshed."
Suggesting that peace was actually the ultimate ideal, even if it was maybe more often preached by priests than practiced by warriors.
That seems to be Nitobe's implication, yes.
Okay, what about the role and training of women? That feels like a potential contradiction within this very masculine warrior code.
It does seem like a paradox. Nitobe acknowledges women were mostly confined to the home, but they weren't just passive or idle. They were trained in fortitude, in enduring hardship, just like the boys, sometimes even trained with weapons like the naginata, a polearm.
Not for fighting in battles, though.
No, more for defending their personal honor, protecting the home, and maybe, most importantly, for educating their sons in Bushido principles. They were the first teachers of the code.
Girls got a dagger, a kaiken, when they came of age, right?
Yeah.
For self-defense or suicide if necessary.
Yes. And the practice he mentions of women tying their knees together before suicide to ensure modesty even in death, it shows how highly chastity and decorum were valued, seen as more important than life itself.
Were they expected to have other accomplishments too?
Oh, yes. Music, dancing, literature, these were part of their education, but primarily for entertaining at home, for hospitality, not for public performance or, social climbing.
Nitobe seems to emphasize that Bushido demanded self-sacrifice for something bigger than yourself, and that applied to both men and women, just in different ways.
Exactly. He brings in some sociological ideas here, like Herbert Spencer's theory that women's status tends to be lower in militant societies.
And he says that fits the samurai class, where women had the least freedom, compared to maybe lower classes or the very top nobility.
Yes, he suggests that the lower classes and the highest aristocracy, who were maybe less directly involved in constant fighting, saw more equality. He also considers Guizot's idea that European chivalry actually improved women's status, suggesting maybe that applied more to the less militaristic upper nobility in Japan, too.
So he wasn't saying they were treated as equals, but maybe saw the differences based on role, not inherent inequality.
He frames it as difference versus inequality, yes. And he touches on that Japanese idea of husband and wife becoming one flesh, which meant, culturally, that praising your spouse in public was like praising yourself considered bad taste, a contrast to Western individualism.
Interesting cultural nuance. Okay, as Nitobe gets towards the end of his book, he starts talking about Bushido's wider influence beyond just the samurai class, right, and into modern Japan.
Yes, he argues really forcefully that Bushido didn't just stay within the samurai class. It seeped out, permeated the whole nation. He calls the samurai not only the flower of the nation, but its root as well. They set the moral tone.
That saying comes up again. As among flowers, the cherry is queen, so among men, the samurai is lord. That really captures the ideal they represented.
It does. He believes Bushido shaped pretty much all aspects of Japanese life and thought, one way or another. That modern Japan's intellectual and moral character was basically its creation. He even echoes writers like Malik on the idea of aristocratic influence shaping society.
How did it affect the common people then?
He says it filtered down and acted as leaven among the masses. It provided this core moral standard for everyone, the Yamato Damashi, which he translates as the soul of Japan, that essential spirit.
He even gives examples of using Bushido ideas like loyalty to inspire people or solve problems, like with a backsliding Christian convert or a student strike.
Yeah, showing its practical moral force even in unexpected contexts. And he directly connects Bushido to Japan's incredibly rapid modernization in the 19th century.
He thinks it was the driving force behind the leaders who made that happen. People like Sakuma, Saigo, Okubo, Kido.
He argues it was absolutely the impetus of samuraihood that drove them. He quotes the British writer Henry Norman, who said Japan was different from other Asian despotisms because it had these strictest, loftiest, and the most punctilious codes of honor.
So that deep sense of honor which cannot bear being looked down upon as an inferior power that, for Nitobe, was a key motivator for Japan wanting to modernize and catch up with the West.
Absolutely, a powerful engine for change. And he argues you could still see Bushido's legacy everywhere in modern Japan, in the universal politeness, the physical endurance, the bravery, loyalty, patriotism.
But he's not totally uncritical, is he? He also sees some downsides to its legacy.
No, he's balanced. He achieved some faults, too, maybe a lack of deep, abstract philosophical thinking because Bushido was more focused on action. Also, that exaggerated sensitivity, the touchiness about honor, and maybe a bit of national conceit.
He describes that figure that shows an intense young student, maybe a bit scruffy, carrying a book or cane, looking indifferent but burning with idealism, seeing himself as a guardian of national honor.
Yeah, he sees that type as like the last fragment of Bushido carrying the spirit forward, even if unconsciously.
So a powerful influence, even if people weren't explicitly talking about Bushido all the time.
Exactly. He notes that trying to teach morality using new foreign terms often failed, whereas framing it in terms of old Bushido values resonated much more deeply.
What about Bushido and Christianity? How did he see them interacting?
Well, he had some critiques of how missionaries sometimes operated. He felt they often ignored Japan's own history and moral framework, which could make their message feel alien.
He thought Christianity had universal truths, an old story, but needed to be presented differently in Japan.
Yeah, using language and concepts that resonated with Japan's own moral development. Not just trying to transplant an Anglo-Saxon version onto the existing Bushido foundation, or worse, trying to rip out that foundation entirely. He admired their educational work, especially in morals, but felt their impact on really shaping character was limited because they didn't engage enough with the existing culture.
So he fundamentally believed it was Bushido, pure and simple, that drove Japan's progress.
That seems to be his core argument. But he wasn't naive about its future. He looked ahead and saw some real challenges for Bushido in the modern world.
He compares it to European chivalry decaying, right? And notes Bushido didn't have a big religion like the church to kind of absorb and preserve it after feudalism ended.
Right. And he saw specific threats, things like the rise of money culture, plutocracy, which was totally at odds with Bushido's disdain for wealth, and just modern society itself, which he felt didn't value that kind of class spirit or those very personal feudal style obligations anymore.
Things like popular education, industry, city life, all seen as undermining the old ways. He worried the old honor-based society is giving way to quibbling lawyers and gibbering politicians.
Yeah, he felt the traditional stage for those ardent beads was disappearing. A bit pessimistic there, maybe?
But he didn't think it would vanish completely.
No, despite the pressures. He believed that the core fighting spirit contained something deeper, a diviner instinct to love, which was nurtured by Shinto Mencius Wanyang Ming, and that this deeper spirit would survive. Life was broader now, offering more ways to express these virtues than just warfare.
He references that idea of the ghosts of our fathers guiding our hands and beating in our hearts, still being active. The saying, scratch a Japanese, see a samurai.
Right. The idea that the heritage of honor and valor remains a trust, a legacy, even if the outward forms have to change. So while some predicted Bushido would just crumble, Nitobe hoped or believed it would actually widen its scope, find new ways to apply itself in all walks of life, still be a guiding principle and formative force, just adapted for a new era.
And thinking about its future path, he wondered if it would align more with Christianity or maybe materialism.
Yeah, or maybe that blend he called Hebraism and Hellenism. He noted Bushido's focus on the morality of nations and rulers was maybe closer to Old Testament prophets, whereas Christian ethics seemed more focused on the individual soul. He kind of dismissed Nietzsche's master morality as just a temporary backlash.
And because Bushido didn't have rigid dogmas, he thought it could potentially just fade away as a distinct code, like the cherry blossom again, willing to die. But its core virtues, like Stoicism, would just become part of the national character.
That seems to be his final thought, that its specific form might disappear, but its energy, its vitality, the power of spirit mastering flesh through inner strength that would continue to be felt, wherever people strive for ideals.
Wow. Well, that was quite the journey, really digging into Inazo Nitobe's complex perspective on Bushido, from its diverse origins, the core virtues, to those unique institutions, the powerful symbols, and his thoughts on its enduring influence and what the future might hold, all drawn straight from the source material you brought us.
Yeah, it really gives you a window into what Nitobe saw as the absolute bedrock of Japanese morality and character. This powerful, sometimes unseen force that he believed shaped the nation and, well, continued to echo.
And looking closely at a historical code like this, through Nitobe's eyes anyway, it doesn't just tell us about another society's past. It really offers these profound ideas about morality, honor, duty, things we can reflect on ourselves, compare and contrast with our own values.
Absolutely. And Nitobe left us with that image. Bushido, willing to fade like the cherry blossom, but its spirit enduring, shaping the future. So thinking about the challenges he saw coming, materialism, changing social structures, and just the sheer complexity of life today, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How might that enduring spirit show up now in a world so incredibly different from the one that created it?